So you know exactly what your AI costs per seat for your company. It could be $25 a seat, whatever it is, it's on the card statement somewhere. But what we don't have an idea about is what it costs to leave that system. And that gap is the entire subject of this video, because this week, the chief executive of a major AI firm stood up and accused the big AI companies of believing that, this is his phrase, deserve to colonize your enterprise. And he's not a neutral party here. He sells the alternative. So I'll come back to that. But he said basically in the same week that they reported revenue up 93% for Palantir, and separately Google assembled something in the region of $200 billion of financing around Anthropic's computing needs. And Amazon separately committed $50 billion to OpenAI. So those are not separate stories. They're all the same story, and it's not the one that everybody thinks, believe it or not. There's more happening. So it's not about any longer who builds the smartest model. It's about who becomes the intelligence layer inside your company. So bear with me here. Who sits between you, your staff, and your customers? Because whoever remembers your decisions and eventually acts on your behalf is going to control your company. So in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to show you 3 things that you can do to protect yourself, and also just to understand this concept before you realize that it's too late, because we're all baking ourselves into this and cementing ourselves in, but we're not aware of it while it's happening, because it feels good just to offload everything to AI. So now, while you're operating, knowledge is quietly becoming more than the model, the value of the model itself. So, and also I'll show you a 3-part structure to get this all tidied up, and a kind of a couple of weeks test at the end to solve it. So, right, let's get into it. Let's start with Palantir, what they actually sell, and one, let's say from a corporate standpoint. We won't get involved in the political heavy stuff right here. We're just staying focused on the corporate AI side. So basically what they don't build is the most famous model. They're not building Anthropic, they're not building ChatGPT, they're not building the user kind of front that's sold into small businesses. But it doesn't make the chips, and it doesn't even have like the biggest cloud model. What it sells is context and control. Its systems map out an organization's people, their assets, their rules, their permission, their data, and then basically lets AI operate inside those boundaries. So the model supplies the intelligence, and then Palantir supplies the context and the guardrails in essence. And right now, an extraordinary amount of corporate money is moving towards the second thing, not the first. And what I mean by that is basically, this is not what makes Karp's accusations interesting, even though he's obviously talking his own book, all right? And I want to be balanced here, because this is where a lot of the coverage goes wrong. The frontier labs kind of strongly dispute the idea that they're hoovering up enterprise secrets. OpenAI, for example, says it doesn't train on business customers' data by default. Anthropic says it doesn't use Claude for work data to train its models, all right? Amazon says Bedrock doesn't share customer prompts with model providers. So this isn't a story about spreadsheets being secretly stolen here. I don't necessarily think that's the single risk. The risk is much less dramatic and much more actually expensive for the company that you're working in, if you're an exec, or the company that you own. It is dependence. Because once your provider sits between you and your employees and your customers, remembers your projects, connects to your CRM, understands your pricing, and starts basically talking across actions across your systems, switching becomes something different from canceling a subscription. You're not changing a model, you're replacing a part of your company's memory. And I see that myself, even in terms of memory. In the last week or two, I've really noticed that using AI for the purpose of being faster, more productive, it's phenomenal, but I'm actually realizing in certain projects and aspects, I have to revert back to that chat to understand, or that workflow to understand where I am mentally, versus in the past, I might have had maybe not a laser accurate memory on it, but I would have had at least the broad strokes of comprehension of where we are with it. So I guess, we have to use it in the right way, but let's get back to this. So these 2 things basically are completely compatible. And what I mean by that is a supplier can honor every single privacy commitment in its contract and still become practically impossible for you to replace. So now let's look at why the money is so enormous, because it tells you what they're buying. So Google has reportedly assembled around $200 billion of financing to support Anthropic's access to chips and infrastructure, all right? Amazon has committed $50 billion to OpenAI, including a large chunk of its own computing capacity. And separately, SoftBank's cumulative commitment to OpenAI may reach the mid-60 billions, and it's borrowed to fund part of it. So those are not software numbers. Those are the numbers you see when someone's trying to become and build and own infrastructure. And infrastructure is a wonderful business, because whoever controls that layer earns from several different directions at once. Look at those who built the rail lines in the US in that booming gilded age, okay? So for example, in the AI world, we're talking the chips, the cloud capacity, the model usage, the enterprise software on top. And eventually the agents doing actual work inside the customer's business. The chatbot was never the product. The chatbot was the way in. The search capacity, the way we've all used ChatGPT. Hey, tell me the best way to organize flights from Miami to New York, or what's the best time of year to visit Arizona, whatever. That was just the way that got us all hooked and using it. Now, basically, it's what's changed in the last 18 months is that, the first generation of workplace AI essentially answered questions. Okay, you asked it, it replied, nothing persisted beyond that. The second generation drafted things. So for example, emails, reports, decks, useful, but you could still replace them in essence. But the next generation arriving now remembers and acts. It monitors your pipeline. It prepares account reviews. It updates your forecasts. It resolves customer requests. It has initiative, takes initiative basically. It flags, unusual activity, transactions. It coordinates other agents like ChatGPT voice in the last couple of days. Like you can use it like a voice command, like a voice quarterback. And this is enormously more valuable. It also enormously more difficult to replace. So picture a system that spent basically 2 years learning how your company works. It knows, which customers churn and what the early signals look like with that. It knows which discounts finance will actually potentially approve. It knows when a difficult account needs someone senior in the room. It's got a record of thousands of decisions and basically what happened next. The intelligence processing, all of that is rented, fine, but the cumulative context is your company. That's 20 years of institutional judgment written down for the first time, basically. And if only copies of it live inside one supplier's product, as in inside one ChatGPT or AI or Claude, for example, then the doorway to your own institutional memory is open. So, which brings me to what I think AI sovereignty actually means for a normal business. It doesn't mean building a data center, obviously not. It doesn't mean training your own model, clearly not. It doesn't mean banning cloud software. No, don't get me wrong. We're not going to annoy, Jane down the back who loves it for accounting. It means keeping the practical ability to change supplier without losing your business and what it's learned. So here's the structure. 3 layers, and if you take one thing from this video, really try to just make it this. Bear in mind and just understand this concept before it's too late, because we all just get used to using AI, and before you know it, we're too deep in and we can't even go back to the principles that we needed to know before we got into it, all right? So you're renting intelligence, all right? You're renting, beyond the intelligence, you've got the control action, and then, you've got to understand that you rent it and you want to rent it loosely. And what I mean by that is use whichever model is best for the task. So one's better at coding, one's better at long documents, one's better for, high volume emails, another has privacy terms that match what you need. The model should be powerful but completely replaceable. So if swapping means rebuilding your process, then you haven't rented it. You're essentially married to it. Now, layer 2 is the context. You want to make sure you own that. That's your approved internal documents, your customer history, your pricing, your logic, basically, your decision records, your process definitions, basically, your evaluations of what good looks like to AI. So all of that lives in systems that you control, and that you can export it in a format that's actually usable somewhere else. What I mean by that is, before you go feeding in tons of info into AI, or rather, as you're feeding it in, if you're doing it on a day-by-day basis, like a little nugget every day, then try have some separate document, whether it's a Word doc, whether it's even just an iOS note, if you're using a Mac. Try to dump all that, recommendation knowledge into that separate document so that you can export to a different tool before you're stuck using Anthropic, for example, or OpenAI, all right? So the next thing is basically understanding what the agentic layer, what the agent within your AI has access to. So what it can write, what it can send, what it can spend, what it can delete. Everything consequential should be logged. Where the access points are is so vital. Every permission stays revocable. So anything expensive or irreversible needs a human to approve it, essentially. So rent intelligence, okay? Own the context, and then control the action. That's the whole architecture, and it lets you move without handing over the company, and you're not losing control of things. Now, measurement, because that's the phrase of Karp's that's worth kind of stealing, shall we say. He calls it token maxing. Businesses treating AI consumption as if it were progress, and it is good criticism. Tokens are an input. No sales director ever, celebrated the number of emails sent when revenue was actually falling. So no factory equally celebrated electricity consuming if output doesn't rise. But plenty of companies are proudly kind of reporting AI usage with no idea essentially about what it produced, really. So let me make that concrete. Take a service business with 20 account managers. Each spends, for example, 4 hours a week gathering information and assembling client reports. That's 4,000. Actually, you know what? I'm going to skip the analogy about the hours. I'm just going to say that unless there's a clear tangible output to the usage of AI, then scrap it. Don't use it until you're clear on that. I know you got to try it, but make sure you're keeping that top of mind so you're not just burning tokens. So we want to always ask yourself, like, did the reports actually get more accurate or just faster? Did clients actually notice? That's the big thing. Did retention move? Can each account manager now carry more revenue? Did risk go up? And crucially, how would it be to move that workflow somewhere else? And the last one is the column that nobody really has in their dashboard. So we want to think about, things like time, the error rate, the margin impact, the capacity recovered, and the dependency created. So if you're only measuring users and prompts, then you're measuring activity and you're essentially calling it value. But the people who really win this is because I think there are three groups, and the third one is, most of us here. So let's get into this and then we'll summarize. The first winners are the owners of the super scarce infrastructure, the chips, the power, the compute, the data center, the cloud capacity. That's where the $200 billion bets are landing. And it's not a game that we're in per se, all right? The second winners, or maybe we're investing, as stock shares, but let's be honest, we're not owning the full infrastructure. Right, the next group, the second winners are the control and implementation layer. The people who can connect models to real workflows. They can secure the data, they can manage permissions, and they can prove a financial result. So, for example, Palantir's quarter is one very loud signal of that demand, and there's a services business hiding in it for anyone who can do it competently. Tons of opportunity here. It's an insane number of opportunities to provide services to a company. Imagine you approached a legal firm, an insurance firm, etc., and you provided these services to help them build a knowledge base on AI. I mean, it's invaluable. But the third group is the interesting one, okay? So ordinary businesses or ordinary execs with an extraordinary context. For example, a law firm with decades of structured judgment, or an insurer with better claims data than its rivals, or an agency that genuinely knows which creative convert and from paid traffic, and they prove it, or a manufacturer sitting on thousands of maintenance decisions, or a lender with a sharper way of reading risk. So none of these companies need to build a frontier model. They need to combine rented intelligence with knowledge that nobody else has, basically. And the losers are the ones who confuse access with advantage. So the same model as everybody else, fed generic information, produces essentially generic output with nothing that compounds. That isn't transformation. That's more expensive, to become average. It's a way to just burn tokens in essence. So here's a couple of tips I would strongly recommend is, number one, understand as you're building up your company's database on a tool, for example, make sure you're using an ancillary document to track all of the recommendations that you've given it. The next thing is make sure you're extremely diligently tracking the access that agentic AI has to everything. So what it can send, what computers it has access to if you're using remote work, for example, or some team members using remote, what it can spend as well, or what it can send emails, what it can spend as well in the future. That's coming down the track super quick. And then the final thing is make sure that you're aware of other tools. So if it comes to it, you can export to another tool. Don't become beholden to one, because what you'll find is some sort of shift or some sort of governmental change, and before you know it, you're out of action. Because we have to remember that every month and every quarter that goes by, we're using our brains less, we're relying on AI more. It's amazing, we're getting more done, but the expectation to get more done is also increasing. So therefore we have to understand that we don't want to get trapped and locked out of our own system by putting all of our eggs in one basket with all of our corporate or career knowledge in one place, and then no tracking of who has access to what, and then also no ability to extract, export, and to fire up on a new tool. So whether you're running your own business, or whether you're an exec in a business, or frankly, whether you're thinking entrepreneurially about what opportunities there are, there's a huge kind of risk and opportunity here. There's a risk if you're running your own business, you got to get this stuff organized. There's a massive opportunity, however, if you're working in a company and you want to go to your boss and become the go-to person to get this all organized. And finally, if you're entrepreneurial and you're looking at taking a punt on something, then this is a huge opportunity to go to the likes of the insurance company, the likes of the real estate company, the likes of the local lawyer who has 30 staff. These are massive opportunities. These companies don't have an AI expert internally. You can become that. You can be the one also to explain to them how you're going to ensure that you're duplicating them across multiple platforms so that they're secure, and ultimately you can have a very sticky business that they will not leave you. Absolutely not, because they will be needing your guidance. Anyway, stick around. I would love to, if you would subscribe, I'd be super grateful. We're learning here together every day. There's a ton of opportunity abound for, whether you're in a business as an exec, whether you're entrepreneurial and you're looking at opportunities, or whether you're owning a business. We're all here learning together, understanding how this is all rapidly developing so quickly, and we got to stay abreast of it, because truly it is changing the way the world works, like the Industrial Revolution. And if we think we can put our heads in the sand, then, sadly, we're going to get left behind. So let's learn here together and keep moving forward 1% more every single day.